I'm Colm. I'm Executive Director of Amnesty International here in Ireland. My colleague Fiona Crowley is our Research and Legal Manager who has responsibility for our work in the area of mental health. To give you some idea of what we want to cover today, I just want to give you a quick overview of Amnesty International, give you some sense of how mental health care is a human rights issue, why Amnesty International has human rights concerns in Ireland in that regard, Amnesty Ireland's campaign, and how we believe the P&A can help to make rights real in the area of mental health. Amnesty International is a worldwide voluntary movement working for human rights. We are independent of any government, any political persuasion or religious creed, and we are solely concerned with the impartial protection of human rights. We're a democratic, self-governing movement with just over, 2 million members and supporters in over 150 countries and territories in the world, with more than 20,000 members and supporters here in Ireland. So our move into social justice at home, we're traditionally associated for about the first 45 years of our history with working on human rights issues in other countries other than in a domestic sense. And our move into social justice at home here in Ireland was the result of a change in our rules, two particular rules, one of which banned Amnesty sections from working on domestic human rights issues, and the other was Amnesty's move into the full spectrum of human rights. When the organisation began, our focus was very much on civil and political rights, and of course, as you're only too well aware, the whole area of economics and social cultural rights hadn't been fully expressed in a global discourse on human rights. So that work began in 2003 and resulted from a decision by our governing body, our International Executive Committee, that human rights activists have a duty to promote not only legal justice but also social justice. So what are human rights? Human rights are rights and freedoms that belong to all human beings. In that sense, they are inherent. They apply to every person purely by nature of the fact that they are human. They're inalienable. They cannot be given up and may only be taken away or restricted in limited circumstances. They are universal. They apply to all of us equally, irregardless of any distinctions. And they are interdependent and indivisible. They're of equal importance. A breach of one right will often have a detrimental effect on the enjoyment of another right. So the right to liberty, for instance, and the right to health are indivisible. They are interconnected. They can't be broken down or divided. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was the first global expression of what rights meant. Adopted in 1948 without a single dissenting voice by the nations of the world, its ambition was to create a world where the dignity and humanity of each and every person would be respected by all nations. And Article 1 of the Declaration, as a very broad statement, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. So where are human rights set out in law? Important from our perspective really to try to articulate that rights are not some set of lovely principles. They're not a collection of very noble and well-meaning or significant words. They are legal. Human rights are law. They're set out in international treaties, covenants and conventions by the United Nations, the Council of Europe and other international and regional bodies, and of course in domestic national constitutions like Bunthroch na hÉireann and laws, for example, the European Convention on Human Rights Act 2003. So rights conventions are treaties, sometimes called conventions or covenant. It's a legally binding contract between nations. So when we sign up to an international treaty that has a force of law, it is legally binding. It means that we agree as a nation to take on certain obligations under international law. In some countries, international law is automatically part of national law and enforceable in their national courts as soon as it's adopted. That's a legal system called monism. In France, for instance, as soon as a new treaty is agreed, every French citizen has access to those rights and can take immediately a case through the French legal system should that right not be fully respected by the state. In Ireland and other countries, domestic legislation has to be enacted to incorporate international law. It's called a dualist system. And while there's usually a stated obligation when a treaty is ratified, it's generally not complied with. And in the Irish context, that's our greatest challenge. Ireland is very good at signing up to international treaties and conventions, very good at promoting increased standards and high standards in human rights treaties, but not at all good, unfortunately, in many regards, in bringing those into domestic legislation and realising them here in Ireland. So some of the conventions that really are the core instruments in human rights terms: in 1966, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and in the same year, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Human rights conventions, as I said earlier, are legally binding. And the convention that established the framework for the United Nations, the 1945 UN Charter, committed member states legally to promote universal respect for human rights. Mental health is a human right. Article 12 of the International Covenant on Economic and Social Cultural Rights, again adopted in 1966, says that everyone has the right to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of mental health. That's a legal obligation that our government signed up to. This requires mental health services that are available, so in adequate numbers throughout the state, accessible, that means physically, geographically, economically, without discrimination, and information about those services must also be accessible, that the services are acceptable, that they're respectful of cultural and traditions, and that they're of good quality, both scientifically and medically appropriate, with properly trained staff and adequate facilities. Obviously, huge resource questions there. The 1991 UN Principles for the Protection of Persons with Mental Illness said that all persons have the right to the best available mental health care, which shall be part of the health and social care system, and that all persons with a mental illness or who are being treated as such persons shall be treated with the humanity and respect for the inherent dignity of the human person. Those rights include the right to be treated and cared for as far as possible in the community, where inpatient care is necessary, the right to be treated near one's home, and the right to return to one's community as soon as possible, the right to be treated in the least restrictive environment and with the least restrictive or intrusive treatment appropriate in the circumstances, and the right to informed consent with treatment. I was struck when your General Secretary was addressing conference earlier on how consistent many of these principles are with the advocacy that the PNA already carries out in this area. Other rights include the right to live and work as far as possible in the community, the right to an individual care, treatment or recovery plan agreed between the clinician and the patient and reviewed and revised regularly, the right to confidentiality of personal information and the access to such information, and the right to be treated in an environment that is as close as possible to those of that of the normal life of persons of similar age. So essentially we're talking about the right to be treated with dignity, the right to the highest available standards of care, and for that to be entirely accessible. These same 1991 UN principles demand accountability measures. That means that states have to provide mechanisms which are enforced to promote compliance with the principles for the inspection of mental health facilities, for the submission, investigation and resolution of complaints, and for the institution of appropriate disciplinary or judicial proceedings for professional misconduct or violation of the rights of a patient. They demand implementation measures. States should implement the present principles through appropriate legislation, legislative, judicial, administrative, educational, and other measures, which shall they review periodically. And states shall make the present principles